Sue, just put your hand up. Welcome to everybody who's joined us for this celebration of books and writing here in Zimbabwe, and if you're joining us from further afield. Thank you, Meredith and Paul, for hosting us here at the Hotel 528 in Victoria Falls, and also to Pan Macmillan, who publish us both and who have lent their support to this event. I'm really thrilled to be here with Tony Park for a book signing. It's my first book signing in Zimbabwe. And we'll be asking each other questions, and we'll both be answering those questions at the same time. Yeah, not at exactly the same time.
Alternating, yeah. Yeah, thanks, Josie. So my name's Tony Park. I'm an Australian who writes novels set in Africa, funnily enough, and I've been here since last August when I managed to escape Australia, and I have no intention of going back home. I can say that because it's 2 a.m. in Australia and hopefully no one's watching. So thanks very much to our studio audience who's gathered here on the Treetop Bar at 528, which is fantastic. It's a lovely venue, and behind us in the distance is the iconic Victoria Falls. So if you want to get two authors coming together to talk about place, you can't get a much better place than this.
Yeah.
We're on the first day of a 7-day writing safari, where we'll be spending a couple of days here for all about writing in Victoria Falls, and then 5 days in the wilds of Wangi National Park with 9 wonderful writers. I don't even say aspiring writers because they're all writing. They're all writers. Yeah. And for anybody watching, it doesn't matter whether you're published or not, we do this because we love it, and we're all writers, and it's good to be here in fellowship in this. I'm going to kick off just by, on that note, asking Joanne a question. How important is the place in which you set your novels, and how do you go about creating a believable sense of place for your characters to live in?
Okay, well, I want to start by telling you a little story. I took eons to start writing my first book, even though it became after a while quite clear in my head, and the reasons for that are that I had in my head the idea that if I typed the first word or possibly the first sentence, I would then look at that word or sentence and with a blinding flash of insight realize, oh my God, you have no talent. So if I didn't write it down, you know, it was all still possible. And during that time, I used to torture my then husband by regaling him with memories of my grandparents' farm. And my grandparents' farm was really the impetus that drove my first book, The Innocence of Roast Chicken. They weren't career farmers, my grandparents. They retired to a farm in the Transvaal, and in my memory, that farm was magical, and of course I associated it with holidays. And I would regale him with the sensory experience of it. The figs straight off the tree first thing in the morning, the icy splash of the reservoir on a hot summer's day, the streak of the feral cat that would lope across the horizon at sunset, and the barrels full of down feathers, which if you plunged your arms into them felt like clouds, and the deep muck of the soil when the first plops of rain fell on the dust, and the squee-bang of the fly screen door leading into the kitchen, where there was a range which always had a pot of porridge or rooibos tea boiling on it, and there was always a jar of soot cookies to raid. So that husband would ask me, probably why he's not still my husband, what was wrong with it? And I said, why should something be wrong with it? And he said, well, that's not really real life, is it? I mean, there must be something wrong with it. Nothing's that perfect. And that began my mind whirring, because a child, of course, remembers the idyllic, the sensory. But of course, there was something huge that was wrong with it. It was the system that underlay a farm like that in 1960s South Africa was what was wrong with it. And so I set about creating a farm just like that, but I moved it to the Eastern Cape because that's where I grew up, and I felt I could envision it easier by then. And I set about making it just as perfect as a child a little bit like me might have seen it in all its wildness. And then I set about spoiling it. Because I had to make it the cause of her loss of innocence. Her sense of that unspoiled landscape erodes as the story progresses, and as she becomes aware that it wasn't perfect at all. It was underpinned by an inhuman and an unjust system. So Place not only gave me the kernel of that idea, but it was immensely important to story. So it has to be lyrical to start with. It has to sing with the child's magic. And her later experience of the farm has to contrast starkly with that. So for my first book, the place is not just texture. It's actually integral to that story that I was telling. And funny enough, that's almost the first thing people always say about particularly that book. They say strong sense of time and place. And perhaps that's because I felt it so strongly. And I suppose for me as a human and as a writer, I feel very formed and by the landscape that I grew up in. And because of that, I feel immersed in it, and that enables me, and I think that's a big part of creating a sense of place for your readers, is feeling that immersion and being immersed enough and finding the words that will put that across and allow your readers to be immersed, because it's not enough for you to be immersed. You have to create the sense of the place for your readers so that they are immersed in it. And I think that time and place are, because of that, are pretty forefront in all my books. So I just thought, to finish up this answer, I would read you just a couple of tiny extracts from different books just to give a sense of that place. So from that first book, just one little paragraph. Wild figs dominated the cramped acacias. The fleshy arms of euphorbias thrust their way above thick bushes, stems lank and twisted. The path twined through the wall of vegetation, and I followed it, clambering over the coiled monkey ropes and the trees bent across the walkway. So just, I suppose, full of specifics. So from another of my books called My Brother's Book, my partner always jokes and says, "Oh, your brother wrote a book too." But actually, yeah, it's another book. From a certain point, it's hard to keep those days discreet. Heedless and wild, they skimmed through icy swims, wound through forests and pushed through bush made sturdy by extremes. They trampled barefoot through dust and divilky thorns and freewheeled past meerkat and jackals and bushbuck. And another of my books called Sad at the Edges, you could smell the feral cats in the rustle of sudden escapes, the anemones in their salt, and probably, if you sat long enough, the whales in their pheromonal romancing beyond the breakers. And then just to finish up, in The Imagined Child, the setting is a small rural village in the Free State. So here's just a little textural paragraph. Dr. Babu, white robes flapping, left the hardware stop with a store with a bottle of what looked like paraffin. He headed across the road to his glass-fronted shop. A row of sad faces waited beneath a sign that promised penis enlargement and powerful erection, making you liked at work, curing the sickness of the kidney, barren women, lost lovers, and the bewitched, Udogotelo Wezinto. She passed the Indian shop where mattresses jostled buckets and transistor radios across the covered pavement. Women wrapped in bright blankets called to friends on the other side of the road.
Absolutely brilliant. Yeah, fantastic.
Tony.
Brilliant. I think if you look at the importance of place, I hate to say it, but place is probably the most important thing to me in the novels that I write, because I think it's why people buy them in the first place. I mean, let's face it, thrillers and crime novels and mysteries, the sort of things that I write, are a dime a dozen. So there has to be a reason for someone to pick up a book. Of course, my books are all set in Africa, but I'm an Aussie, you know. But what I found out very early on was that a big chunk of my market in Australia and New Zealand, even the UK, elsewhere, is expatriate Africans, Southern Africans, people from Zimbabwe, people from South Africa who have moved for whatever reason. I'm not going to get political, who've moved to Australia or had to uproot their lives and go. And invariably, when I meet these people, they usually say the same thing. When I saw there was an Australian writing a book about Africa, I thought it would be crap. Yeah. Most of the times there's a but after which fills my heart with gladness. But it does put certain responsibilities on me to put the place right, because I'm writing about other people's homes, even though this is a continent that I've been visiting for 27 years, my wife and I, every year, except when I went to another place, Afghanistan, but that's another story. So 26 out of the last 27 years. And it's a continent, a number of different countries and cultures and different areas that we've come to love. And it puts a huge responsibility on me to get that place right. So not only is place important for me, because quite possibly the only reason people buy the books is because they're set in Southern Africa, and or that at least attracts their attention, but I have to keep it forefront in my mind and the whole time. Now, all of those people, I can generalise this, who I meet, say, at book talks or in bookstores in Australia, if they're from Zimbabwe or South Africa, and they will tell me often their story and why they had to leave their homelands, and these are very valid and sometimes serious reasons. And they're happy to be living in another country, but there is not one of them who, after a glass of wine or beer, does not say, but I miss that place. And I am now finding myself under even more pressure to not only get it right, but to do it justice and respectfully, if not cater to that, respect it. The fact that place is in our heart, where we're from, where we're born, no matter where we choose to live. It's a part of us. And so when it comes to writing, I think it's a good thing to keep place in the front of mind. It keeps me on my game, but it keeps me centred as well. Because when you look at then how to describe a place, as we'll come to, it takes in so many different elements as well too. So yeah, I think it is really, really, really important for me. And I don't have any sections yet to read on that, but I would go as far as to say it's the most important thing for me, and perhaps for any writer. And one of the things I found starting off writing, I started trying to write a novel. I always wanted to write, and I had a number of failed attempts. And this is how not to do it, by the way. I left work with the support of my wife. She gave me 6 months off to try and write a novel. And this is my life's ambition. I thought, what do I do? Now I have to write a novel. I thought, where am I going to set it? All I knew was I wanted to write fiction and probably write a thriller. But I hadn't really given enough thought to where it was. And so I made a number of cardinal errors that first-time writers can make. I thought, I want people to buy this book. I wanted to get published, and I thought, I was so big-headed. I had my sights set on international markets. I thought, what do people in the UK or America or Germany want to read from an Australian writer? I know, the Outback. I thought, like Crocodile Dundee and the Thornbirds and all that kind of thing. I'll write a book set in the Outback. One teeny problem. I'd never been to the Outback. So I read a couple of books about the Outback. Well, these are not the ways to go about things. So I think if you're writing about place, and place is important to you, it has to come from something, preferably the heart, or if not, somebody else's heart, because it's so important. So I've got a question for you now.
Yes, I just wanted to add to that what brought it home was this afternoon one of our delegates on our writing safari said she grew up in Zimbabwe and hasn't been back for many years, and as she stepped off the plane she choked up and the tears came unexpectedly because it felt like home.
I'm going to steal that. Copyright it. Very good. That's
okay, ask a question.
As humans, we like to think that we're observed, but in fact it doesn't.
Actually, I'm supposed to
ask you.
You're
going to ask me that? Oh, no.
You asked me the other last
I've got
question.
It wrong.
That's fine.
We're not scripted at all.
It doesn't matter. Yes, we all like to think we're observant. Everybody thinks we're observant, but you just have to notice when police ask you know, witnesses what they noticed, that we are not naturally observant necessarily. So noticing specific details about place, using all the senses to provide a sense of time and place. How do you go about this when you visit a place that will become a setting?
Yeah, I think I've tried everything. You know, I've tried making notes. I have a notebook. I used to work as a journalist, so I take notes about places where I'm at. If I'm in a pub, I'll write it on the back of a coaster or something like that, and then lose it, or whatever. I take my phone out, I take pictures and videos. You know, often I don't really rely on those things, because I think what I've found is you have to train yourself.
Yeah.
You know, as we both worked as journalists, and you were probably taught as I were, a journalist is a trained observer. You have to learn this kind of stuff. You have to learn to look, and most importantly, I think, listen as well, too, because the photographer's there taking pictures. But you have to listen, you have to develop an ear for dialogue, for how people speak. Because, of course, when we talk about place, it's not just the physical location, it's how people speak, you know, their turn of phrase, their accent, you know, and that has to help build a picture. You know, people in South Africa say now all the time. Just now. You know, the number of times my editors in Australia have struck out that second now because I think it's a typo and I have to go putting it back in, because this is an important part of the place that we're in. I think what I used to find as a journo is if you just stop and listen and look, you absorb an awful lot. And I find that's what I do. I tend to sort of draw it in, and it can take a little bit of time. And I'm a big fan of a particular book, Stephen King's book called On Writing, a Memoir of the Craft, which I reckon is the best book ever written about how to write. Funnily enough, it's the only Stephen King book I've read, because I'm not kind of really interested in horror stuff, but I think he should be happy he just wrote that book. And he has a phrase that says, a few well-chosen details will stand for the rest. So you don't need to go and research absolutely everything, but I think it's important to be able to put your reader in that place. And you have to bear in mind that reader could very well have been to that place, particularly in my market when I'm writing about Zimbabwe for Zimbabweans in Australia, or as we have even in our writers group, Australians who are regular visitors to Southern Africa. So you want to put people straight in the scene and anchor them there. So an iconic landmark can help, but then that's not enough, because it's not a travel guide. You know, it's not the Lonely Planet guide to Victoria Falls. You know, you don't have to describe every building and every street. But then you do your research by listening to what people are talking about, the way in which they speak, what they're drinking, what they're eating. And I think those sort of things all come from experiencing it yourself. If you can't experience it yourself, we might talk about that a little bit later. To be honest, the thing that I find works for me, and I'm really lucky in this, and it helps me with my tax returns every year, is I just write on location. And I write on location for a couple of reasons. Because I don't have to take notes, I have a bad memory, but it helps me to get it right if I can get it right. So while I'm in Victoria Falls, I will be writing about Victoria Falls or checking. We walked down to the falls today, and I breathed this huge sigh of relief, because my next book, which is called The Pride, comes out at the end of July, is set partly in Victoria Falls. And I had my protagonist, Sonia Kurtz, parking in the car park of the supermarket down the road, not the Pick and Pay, but the other one. And I thought, what is it this year? Is it a ShopRite or an OK, or is it Jay's Spa from 20 years ago? Because I can't remember what it was. And as I walked past the OK, I breathed a huge sigh of relief, because I got it right. So yeah, observing, for me to write on location also allows me to listen to what people are talking about and those sort of things too. My wife and I, just very quickly, I've got more stories than readings, I'm afraid, but my wife and I went on a holiday to Vietnam a number of years ago. I do a novel a year, sometimes a novel and a biography, sometimes more. And I thought, I need a break. I just want to have a break. And so we took a holiday to Vietnam, and we were in Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon. And I was sitting at a cafe on the street, and I looked around, and it was incredible. Just an assault on the ears, the sights, the smells, everything of this amazing, bustling city with its old French colonial architecture, and families of four on one little motor scooter together, and ladies in lovely flowing dresses with masks to protect themselves from the pollution, and just so much history and so much colour, and the food was sensational. I thought, I have to write it. It becomes so second nature, I think, when you get used to doing it. it makes you a better tourist, I think, when you go visit somewhere, if you're there with a purpose to look and really listen and just to absorb as much as you can. And so I started writing the novel at the time I was writing, called An Empty Coast, which, although it's set in Namibia, happens to start in Vietnam for no other reason than I happened to be in Vietnam at that time. So I think it's a good way to write, and it's a good way to travel. I did have one little excerpt to read about this one, a little one for the Victoria Falls crowd. Hope I don't have anything wrong here. This is an extract from The Pride, my next book coming up. Sonia passed the large Zambezi lager billboard welcoming her to the tourist town, carried on past the Sprayview Hotel and turned left off Livingston into the car park near the OK supermarket. Thank goodness. Falls was a tourist town with the main road Livingston Way running down to the bridge over the Zambezi River and Zambia beyond. Side streets and small shopping arcades were lined with shops selling wood and soapstone carvings, safari wear and t-shirts, paintings and other curios. Tour businesses and an army of street touts offered whitewater rafting on the Zambezi River and bungee jumping. As she turned off the engine, a young man with dreadlocks dressed in a shearwater t-shirt, board shorts and rafting sandals emerged from the shadows, holding out a carved stone hippo in one hand and a clutch of pendants, carvings of the snake-headed river god Nyami Nyami, protector of the river, in the other. She wound down the river. Not interested. She's a bit rude, our Sonia. The air outside was heavy and warm. It was always hotter here than in Wangi. Fact, freezing there at the moment. The other day. Where are you from, madam? Germany, he asked, trying to drum up conversation. Would you like to go whitewater rafting tomorrow? None of your business, and no. How long have you lived in Victoria Falls? All my life, 22 years. You know people. He grinned, sensing an opportunity. Everyone, it's a small town.
Great.
So that's what I took. Yeah.
Yes, and I think I'll just reiterate that, you know, what's important is thinking of all your senses too, not just the sights. Because I find, you know, a lot of our memories, a lot of our feelings about a place are really settled in the smells and some of the sounds. And it's not that easy to find the words to describe a smell. So you have to sometimes resort to comparisons or images that will allow people to visualize that smell. But when you think in terms of that, I think your place comes across much stronger. That not just what you're seeing, but what you're hearing and feeling and sometimes tasting and smelling. And I often ask our writing students to just keep doing this as an exercise, because like you did in Vietnam, I find that you have to keep doing it. It's like doing Pilates to keep your body, you know, that whenever, every now and again, I'll haul out a notebook and I will actively observe. I will like try and see, hear, smell, and then I will try to find the words to put that across, because of course it's not enough to show your to allow your reader just to know what you think about a place. So you don't want to you know, tell them it's fantastic, because that tells them nothing about the environment or the place. It tells them what you thought about the place. So yeah, that's what I try and do every now and again.
No, I do get to ask you this one. No.
You get to ask me.
I will ask the question. The way a character views a scene or another person shows us more than just the scene. It shows us more about the observer too. So details work on many levels. I mean, is that something that, you know, we have to pay attention on? How do you do it? Yeah.
I think details are magical. I really do. I think use details well. I think it's one of the most important, like you said, place is one of the most important, and because of that, details are one of the most important things that you can pay attention to in a work. And it's not just to allow your reader to visualize where they are in the world. Every detail you use shows you more about the character who is observing. The kind of person they are is going to notice things because of the kind of person they are, or because of the mood they're in, or their state of mind. So I just thought I would use just to demonstrate that, because I think that's, I mean, it's not something you have to think about, but it's a great tool in your writing that allows you to show rather than tell. Because instead of having to tell your reader what your character is like, you show them what your character is feeling through what they're observing, which does a layered duty. It shows us where we are, as well as showing us more about the character. So in The Imagined Child, my book, she moves to this little town in the Free State, and she's a little bit nervous about her choice, but she's thrilled with her choice. And then later on, she becomes disillusioned, and then still later, really, really disillusioned. So I just thought I'd read you just a couple of little extracts to show those hopefully different states of mind. Because of course we do, when we're feeling different, we notice different things. So early on in the book, she crossed Delaware, 2 rows of low shops dominated at one end by a massive silo and at the other by the sandstone slabs of the Dutch Reformed Church. It summed up the town in many ways. You did see the odd bit of litter, a pothole or two. It was to be expected. A pep store had wriggled in beside the Outfitters with its wooden sock drawers and glass display cases. There was an Ellereens alongside the general dealer with his tin baths and bulk bags of mealie-meal. It wasn't quite as city people like to envision a rural village. Okay, it was flawed, but it was simple. It was real, and it suited her down to the ground. And the secondary road wove through the hills before levelling out into the flat yellow landscape that people always associated with the Free State. Behind her, the road trundled off to KwaZulu-Natal, overburdened by articulated lorries avoiding the toll route. Sunlight glanced off distant windows, forming halos of condensation around a church spire in the hollow of the hills. Then she has a very traumatic burglary, and she goes to town. She had always loved the market square on a Saturday, especially at month end. Donkey carts waited for transport customers. Women spread blankets and sat with legs outstretched, selling socks or fruit, their babies crawling between them. Now, though, it was out of kilter, like a favorite song played off key. The yell of conversations across its breadth sounded raucous and forced. The braziers of shin and samp gave off the sizzle of fat, faintly rancid. A whip-like breeze had mounted a quiet offensive. A film of dust crept up bare legs, and babies became earth-coloured, as earth-coloured as the grassless square. Children rubbed grit from their eyes and wailed. Then towards the end of the story, she gets even more disillusioned. The smell struck them as they rose out of the riverbed on the other side, a sickly scent, the smell of death. It was hard to ignore, hard to raise your senses above and beyond it. It grew stronger as they pushed through the trees to the kopje beyond. A cow lay dead against a stump, abdomen bloated and ready to burst. Flies swarmed in a buzzing cloud. A white-necked raven, disturbed in the process of pecking an eye, lifted its wings and flapped almost insolently away. And then finally, she found herself at the commonage. The horses had been retrieved by the stud farmer. The cows had the place to themselves. They and the tick-birds gorging themselves on their backs. The only sound was their hoarse walk. The river was full, but the rains had brought more trash. Packets and cartons festooned the river's edge and hung brightly in the bushes. The entryway to the river crossing had been trampled by many hoofs into a mash of mud and dung and indescribable animal and vegetable remains. The wind was blowing the other way. She came upon the dead cow before she remembered it was there. The abdomen had burst, entrails exposed, gnawed on by dogs, set upon by flies.
Wow. Oh, wow, that's amazing. Yeah, I think we tend, I think, in a lot of, at least I do, when I think about learning about writing, it's from a point of view of writing fiction, but I also write non-fiction. And when I read non-fiction, I read it quite critically now, because I've written a number of biographies with other people. And perhaps in times gone by, biographies were very much about the one person just telling their story and just relating it, almost like a monologue. But I think of non-fiction these days more like fiction, so I use the same things that we would in a novel. So I think sometimes when people are doing memoirs or non-fiction, they can kind of gloss over the place a little bit. They know it so well, they think everybody else does. So I've got a book that's just come out in South Africa now called Rhino War, which I wrote with Major General Johan Juster, who was in charge of the anti-poaching effort in Kruger for a number of years. He was brought in to paramilitarise the South African National Park's Ranger Corps. And it was really interesting observing the Kruger Park. I live in a house on the edge of the Kruger Park, and it's a place I love, and so many South Africans love it. You know, it's iconic, like Wangi is here, and we view it as this paradise. But that book, what I did with General Juster was to not just have the general recounting his time in the fight against poaching, but to give us his view and the ranger's eye view of this wonderful place. And the book actually starts with the prologue where he and his wife Irina are flying in a national park's helicopter, delivering Christmas presents and Christmas supplies and cakes and things to the various isolated ranger posts around Kruger. And they get diverted to the scene of an armed contact between poachers and rangers. And it's a terrible aftermath that they arrive in. And we start to delve into the realities of what's happening in that fight to protect the rhinos in South Africa and indeed Zimbabwe and many other places. And there's a wonderful line from him where he says, for the person in their family sedan or their 4x4 or their caravan or their open game viewer, this place is a paradise full of magical wildlife. For the ranger on the ground, he says, this place is hell.
Yeah.
It's facing armed opponents. Every tree has a hook on it that's trying to hook you. You're operating in 45 plus degree scalding heat during the day and freezing cold temperatures at night, and your life's on the line facing not only poachers but wild animals that can kill you as well too. And that was a theme that came through, this description of a place that so many of the people who I hope will read that book know, and I hope they'll just gain another view of it by the way General Juster was able to describe that. It's so beautiful, but it's incredibly hostile and incredibly tough to operate in. So I think it really helps to not only ground the story placed there, but to add a whole nother dimension to the story as well. Yeah.
Okay. I'll ask you a question now. Okay. So it's a very quick question. I wanted to ask, how important is research for you in creating a sense of place in your writing?
Yeah. It is really important research, but I think I'm always someone who says that when it comes to writing is don't overdo the research. And I say that for a number of reasons. It's the way I write. You know, I don't have a plot when I start to write. For me, the story is paramount, no matter where it's set. So my focus is on getting stuck into that story, making it up as I go along, getting to the end. And then when I get to the end of that first draft, then I go back and fix stuff up. And often that is doing a bit of research. Now, when you look at place, as I said before, I do a lot of my writing on location. So I'm kind of researching as I go. But as has happened a couple of times over the last 20 books, I've had to write about somewhere that I haven't been. So that's when research does become very important. I had a scene set in my book Safari in Goma, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I was at the time across the border in Uganda seeing the mountain gorillas, but I wanted my action to happen with a Zimbabwean professional hunter and conservationist that end up in gorilla country, but I wanted them in a bit of a war zone. And now the Democratic Republic of Congo, strife-torn place, Goma was just across the border from me. Life is not a Tony Park novel, right? I was not going to go to Goma to do some research. There was too much fighting going on, but I thought I'll park that and later on I'll put a bit of Goma in there. And so when I go back to Australia, and I haven't had to do it often, but what I did for my research, I think the wrong thing to do with research is to get online, you know, or to read a travel guidebook, because you'll get a superficial description of a place, but you'll miss so many nuances. And so I worked out the best way to research was to talk to people. I needed to find someone who'd been to Goma. As it happened, I went to a charity fundraiser and met a lady who had lived for quite a while in Goma, working for the Catholic charity Caritas. And I said, tell me about Goma. Tell me something that only someone who'd been to Goma would know. She says, well, the first thing, it's like the Zambezi billboard coming into Victoria Falls. There's a big Coca-Cola billboard on the roundabout. So that grounder being Goma. Tell me about the place. What do people eat? What do they drink? What do they drink? They drink Guinness and Coca-Cola. It's the most popular drink. I still haven't tried it. So I put a bit of that in there and a couple of other observations that only she could have picked up. Put that in that book. Off that book went. I probably had about a dozen people who emailed me and say, when were you in Goma? I was there too. So people I use for research.
Yeah, I do too. I'm a great believer in talking to people. But I must say I once stopped reading a book because she had the wrong view of Johannesburg coming in from the airport.
Oh, yes.
And I couldn't read anymore.
Yeah.
I couldn't. So
it only takes one thing to undermine a whole story.
It's that willing suspension of disbelief,
Yeah.
and then it's gone. So, and we are journalists, so we, you know, and I believe in novels as being like a greater truth. You are writing something that is true, and so I believe in getting those details right. And also, I agree one can go down a rabbit hole. So it's a matter of balance. But sometimes it makes your writing stilted. So I set part of my brother's book in Bedford, a small village in the Eastern Cape. And I'd been to Bedford countless times through my life. I thought, I know Bedford. But it was old Bedford. It was Bedford slightly before. And I found that I couldn't write because I wanted my characters to go from their boarding house to the milk bar. I knew there was a milk bar, but I didn't know the route they took. And although you might not use many details of that route, if you actually don't know where they're walking, I couldn't visualize it in my head, and therefore I couldn't put it across to my readers. So I went to Bedford, stayed there for some time, and I took pictures all along, and I spoke to people. I got a municipal map, an old municipal map someone found for me, stuck the pictures on the municipal map and wrote what those old shop fronts were at that time so that I knew. And then I walked the routes so that I knew, so that I could also know if it was a tarred road or a dirt road, because some roads were dirt and then the dust rises, and you need to know that. And I spoke to people who'd been in Bedford at that time, and they told me which shop was which, what you could buy, that everybody went to fairs to buy Christmas gifts. And those kind of little details are immensely important.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Absolutely.
I agree. Okay. All right, so that's all we had for you. But we got a couple of little questions online. So we're going to ask ourselves those,
yes.
and also ask if anybody here has a
We
question.
might do one. Yeah. So if you think of your questions now.
Yeah, so shall we start with
start
an
with one of
online
these,
one?
yeah.
Okay, so Frankie said, I'm thinking of setting my new novel in a fictitious Southern African country, which would be part desert, part mountain, with maybe a river or two, and lots of bushveld. Could this work, and what are the pitfalls, or is it better to use a specific country?
Yeah, well, I think the pitfalls are many these days. It's something that used to happen, I think, a while ago. I remember reading a couple of Wilbur Smith books where he had a fictitious but typical sort of African country. And then maybe he was doing that for political reasons or didn't want to get in trouble or something like that. I think, for me, I think my readers not only expect to read about places they know, they expect me to get it jolly well right as well too. Yeah. So I think, look, you've got to ask yourself why you're doing it. It'd be an interesting exercise to create a whole fictional country. I think you're possibly making more work for yourself.
Because you have to do a lot of world building.
Yeah.
You know, you have to think about what the politics are.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
You know, how people live. It's like creating a science fiction story, actually. You have to build...
I had an email from a guy I know who's going to write his memoir about his time in the UK military, and he said, should I be using, giving people pseudonyms, you know, or you know, to give their name a letter or something like that or whatever. So, and I said to him, why are you doing this?
Yeah.
What are you going to say about this person? You know, if you're inventing another country because you're worried about you offending someone in that country, an actual country, they'll probably guess pretty quickly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And for this guy, if you're going to start bagging your mates out by saying what they did in 1982, they'll know soon enough who you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yes, I would rather use a real country myself.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Any questions here before we bang on with the onlines? Anything? Okay. Well, let me think some more, and I'll move along with Mari. Okay, so she says, fine-grained detail about minutiae, particularities, give a rich, textured sense of place and enables readers to both imagine and identify with the setting, character and storyline. But how do you balance that with keeping the story moving? Too much detail tends to make the narrative drag and become irritating rather than interesting. So should I kick off on that one?
Please.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm really interested in what you
That's why I always like to use the word detail rather than description, because when you talk about description, people tend to imagine long paragraphs of, description about a place. And that doesn't do a job. It doesn't do anything. But, you need the brush strokes. You need a few details, and you can weave those details through the action. You don't have to have a paragraph which stands alone, which tells you what somebody looks like. She's moving through the town, thinking things, meeting people, and at the same time, noticing things about the town. So you weave those details through. Then you're not bringing your story to a halt, and you're not bogging people down, and you're giving them just enough absolute specifics. And I think that is the key: specifics, and focus small. Focus on the small particular details, weave them through, and use just enough and no more. And when you come back to your second draft, if you've added too many, take some out.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, but I think it can also depend on what you're writing as well too. I was listening to Josie's descriptions of those towns and everything like that. I thought, I wish I could do that. Because it's beautiful. But if I put too much description of the African bush and the places that I like to camp and set my action in, my editors and publisher would probably cut a lot of it out, because I think there's a reality here too that I'm writing thrillers, and I've been told in no uncertain terms that keep that story moving. And if it's not keeping that story moving, get rid of it, But they'll say also, but you have to have just enough description, to put people in the place. So you can very easily fall into one trap. You can become so driven by pace and plot and the action that you can forget too much, or you can slow down because you're trying to write something so beautiful. So you've got the balance absolutely right. But I think so. It is kind of horses for courses. But as I said earlier, I fall back on that thing from Stephen King's book. A few well-chosen details will stand for the rest. And it's how you express those details.
Everything has a job to do.
Everything has a job to do. And if it's not helping your story along, if it's not telling you about your characters, if it's not anchoring them in the place, then what's it doing there?
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly, yeah. But it's a balancing act that we all struggle with, I think, a lot of the time, and it's difficult to get right. And I think, to be fair, this is where good editors and good first readers of our work will come in. My wife is very good at picking me up if I've got my descriptions of places wrong and things like that, But I think also for my fiction is, it's like the little passage I read before. People go, I've been there, I know that. I've had a number of people email me saying, I've stopped in the Shell Ultra City at Middelburg in South Africa a number of times myself. So then you've nailed it.
Yeah, exactly. Any questions popped up here?
I think it was a conversation I had with Di Morris. He said, stop trying to describe a photograph, describe the charcoal sketch.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, Trevor's saying Di Morris is a very famous Australian, famous inside Australia, very prolific. And so, stop trying to describe the photograph, describe the charcoal sketch. Not every little tiny detail.
That's
in the thing.
The brush strokes, because as I always say, readers are clever. They'll fill in the details.
Yeah, and I've had editors say to me, this has sounded like a travelogue. But I said, everybody wants to know about the speed bumps at Skukuza because they're terrible. Maybe not.
You were saying earlier when you first began writing that you were very focused on the business aspect of it. you were sort of thinking my audience, who I'm selling to, etc.,
Big
etc.
mistake. Yeah.
So now,
Yeah.
and I guess for both of you, how conscious are you of your audience, of the marketing side of things when you're writing?
Can I start with
Go.
that? Yeah, it is a big one because, like, I left work to write a book, you know, and I wanted this to do it, you know, and I took a big knock because that first book went absolutely nowhere, you know, because it was terrible, and I learned that I had written up until that stage in my spare time while working because I loved doing it. And so I went in there with the wrong mindset, that kind of almost business, money-driven kind of thing. So I forgot about that, and it was luckily when I reset, came to Africa on the third trip and had another go, I was in a different headspace and I thought, I'm writing and I just love it. Look, I think also I've probably stayed true to that realisation because if I get someone that doesn't like one of my books, maybe they like the other ones, but they don't like this one, I say to them, well, what do you want me to do? You know, I can't rewrite it for you, you know. And it sounds a little bit selfish, but I write for myself. And I think I write to entertain myself because I enjoy it and I have to keep myself going. It's a hard enough process anyway for me to be thinking, I have to do this for my readers. Now, the flip side to that, what we're talking about today with places, I have to be true, you know, to the places I'm writing about. I can't gloss over stuff or make stuff up. But when it comes to what I'm writing about, it's very much about what interests me, what enjoys me. Then, of course, when you get to the business of being published or publishing your own book, you do have to start thinking about the marketing and the business side of things. And I'm envious. I respect writers that do things, shake things up, and do things differently. You know, because it's not what the readers would normally expect. I'm a big fan of Dion Meyer, the South African author who writes crime novels set in Cape Town, except a few books back he wrote a book called Fever about a pandemic, just before the pandemic. And it was such a shake-up, it was so different to anything that he'd written, that it took me a year or two before I actually picked it up, because it's not, I'll have a look at this, but when I did finally read it, it was fantastic. So I do think you have to keep your readers in mind. You do have to think that, for me, this is a business, but I don't think that I would make a dramatic change in what I'm writing just for the hell of it. So I think it's almost like a relationship, a contract with the reader that, you know, I'm writing something hopefully you want to write about, but you want to read. But the good thing is we probably like to read the same kind of thing, you know, so I shouldn't be trying to write a book about a place or a time or a setting that I don't know about, because I probably wouldn't read that book. You know? Does that answer? Yeah, what do you think, John?
Yes, I think I always say to people that if you set out to write a bestseller and make a fortune, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Write for the writing's sake, and write something that is true to you, that is authentic to you. You will draw the audience that is attracted to that kind of writing, and stay true to you and authentic, and those people who are attracted to that kind of writing will stick with you. And yes, you throw it all in there now and again, and you know, make a departure, and maybe other people will be drawn to your work.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's about being true to what you like to read,
Yeah.
as you said, and therefore what you feel comfortable writing about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Good question. Yeah.
So I have a question about memoir.
Okay. Just hang on in 1 sec for the microphone. There you go.
It's a question about memoir. How do you get around writing about people you know and love without offending? How do you get around it as a writer?
I don't know that you can get around it. If you're a writer, you write. And no matter what you write, fiction or non-fiction, you're going to offend people, I'm afraid. And if you're that worried about offending people, I don't know that, you know, you have to kind of be aware that that's part of the process. And if you're trying too hard to protect people, it's going to come out wrong. I think, sadly, it's one of those things. I mean, people get hurt. My mother thought she was every mother that in every one of my books. She wasn't, but she was upset every single time. And you know, it's one of those things.
Yeah, I find, having worked with a number of people to write their stories as a ghostwriter or a co-writer, as I prefer to call it, there's a process that happens. And writing a memoir, I'm writing their memoirs with them, is very cathartic, of course. And it happens just about every time that people will go down a path of unloading, exploring feelings. I'm not writing this to get payback, but they start becoming very critical about certain people. And then I have to stop them, because then it's almost like writing a novel. You think, is this really advancing the story?
Yes.
Is it really necessary? And then I think you can start to think, maybe I don't need to do that. And the other thing is, I think it's kind of what you're saying, Josie, is that people will find whatever they want in that book. Your mum will associate with that character.
Exactly.
I think that if people read General Eustace's books, if they're pro the Rangers and the fight, they'll think this is a good book. If they think the government's not doing enough to protect rhinos, they will find that in there. People will find what they want in there. I did see something recently on that line about memoir, is that you have to be brave and you have to be honest. Now, how brave and how honest you are.
But I think that's a critical point that you make, that it's not just a process of therapy. A memoir is telling a story, and it has an arc, the same as any work of fiction. So, you have to also be strict with yourself. Am I getting my own back on that awful brother or whatever? Or actually does this take the story forward and tell the story and take it towards the arc, take it towards the climax that I'm taking it to. But within that, be brave.
Be brave, yeah.
On the memoirs, if you're telling a story with the memoirs, how much, as you say, obviously if you're bringing in characters and you don't want to hurt them or something, but also putting your own feeling about how you felt, not whether you like so-and-so, how much should that interfere in the story, if you know what I'm saying? Or should it just be a story, a sort of...
I think that's why people are going to read it, because they want to know what you
feel
and what
about
you think.
it.
And then you can, it's almost like describing place. We do it
Yeah.
not just by describing the look of the person, but it's your interactions with them.
Yeah.
And description goes not only to the sight and the sound of the place and the visuals of the place, it's the dialogue. So I find with a lot of first-time memoirs that I've read or people have sent me, is that they're very light on dialogue. Someone will tell the story and they might describe a picture, but as I think we touched on, you learn a lot about a place and a town and people by the way people speak.
They
and
see
so
it.
you can show your feelings if it's your memoir, and you can kind of show what the other person's like by what they say back to you.
And their
through
body
their
language.
And their body language. The non-verbal
their
cues.
gestures,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
But I think that we immerse ourselves in a story, and we immerse ourselves in the character who is traveling that journey.
Right.
So part of that is that character's, whether that character's a real person or not, that character's thoughts and feelings. So again, it has a job to do, and it's a balance.
I was about
So
to say
you don't
balance,
want to make your memoir completely static by including 3 pages of pure reflection, but you can reflect in between and have enough to allow us to feel that with you, as well as taking your story forward.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, it's more for Tony, but it's to both of you. When you write your characters, do you like them? Like, do you like Sonia Kurtz?
Yes, I do. But she's a difficult person sometimes. I think it's interesting because I don't that's a recurring character that comes through, and I think when I'm making up a new cast of characters, because I am making up as I go along, I don't know them. So I'm at the end of trying to finish a novel at the moment, and I don't know who the baddie is, which happens to me. People say, I never guessed who the baddie was. Well, here's a newsflash. I didn't know either. And so then you've got to decide who do I like and who don't I like, and who's going to get it, who's going to get the boy or the girl or whatever. And then I sometimes have to re-engineer them. So sometimes I have to make them a little bit nicer because they're really evil. or a little bit nastier because they're actually a good person. So I think in the end you develop a relationship with them. Apart from Sonia, once that relationship's over, once that book's over, I forget them. I'm hard pressed remembering their names. Recurring characters are difficult because, you know, I do feel for her. She's a single mum and she has this terrible choice in men usually, you know, and she's trying to bring up her daughter who's, you know, wants to be like her but doesn't want to be like her, and I'm thinking it's a complicated relationship. So yeah, I it's like, you know what, it's probably like any relationship and like anybody you meet people. Some people you like, some people you don't like, some people you like one day, you don't like them the next. So yeah, good question. I don't know. Yeah.
I don't like her at all.
Oh, good.
So, but that comes from, so it's, which I think makes it a better book.
Oh,
because
so you still buy the books?
Well, I guess I did.
Okay.
Buy the book. But that also comes from the reader's my mindset. You know, the fact that she is a single mum and she's drinking and she's stupid and takes chances that she shouldn't take as a mum comes from me. So it's really interesting is that obviously if every single reader had that attitude to her, you wouldn't have brought her back for another 3 books.
Yeah, no. Exactly,
so I'm kind of hoping she's going to get nicer.
Yeah.
Whereas Josie's Omar, you know, could have been my Omar. She was just lovely until she cut the chicken's head off. And then she could have still been my Omar.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's up to the reader. We'll sort of,
yeah,
you know, decide what they like.
And I do like complex characters. I can't bear characters who are only, you know, one-sided. I like them to have flaws. But then the act of creating them and seeing inside them makes me, the same as with anyone. You dislike someone when you first meet them because of the way they speak or the way, but when you get to know them and you hear their story, you can't help but identify, I find, with them. And I feel the same about my characters because I create them. They might have big flaws, but I like them.
I'll give you a little spoiler. Sonia says, I love you in the next book, and her daughter says, I want what you're on.
Okay, I'll read some more.
Okay. I think we're,
Thank you, everybody who joined us in person. Thank you to all the people who are out there on Facebook Live.
Yes,
hopefully
thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Josie.
It was great. Thanks, Tony. That was great fun. Now we can have a drink.
You still live?
Oh, no, that's fine.
How many books do you want to sell to make it a financial?
Oh,